Penguin Random House Audio presents Water Moon, a novel, by Samantha Sotto Yambao, read for you by Cindy Kay. For everyone in search of new beginnings. Part 1. The fallen blossom cannot return to the branch. A broken mirror cannot be made to shine. Chapter 1. The pawnshop of almosts and ifs. Time has no borders except those people make. On this particularly cold autumn day, Ishikawa Hana fashioned that border out of the thinnest layer of skin. Eyelids were useful that way, because as long as she kept her eyelids shut, she could keep the two halves of her life apart. The 21 years she had lived before she opened her eyes, and all that was going to happen next. She pulled her blanket over her head and pretended that her hungover first morning as the pawnshop's new owner had yet to begin. It didn't matter that she was now wide awake, that the last of a tangled string of dreams she could not remember had unraveled more than an hour ago. Her head felt heavier, and her mouth drier than usual, but she figured that this was less on account of the alcohol she'd had the night before than on what awaited her. In a few moments, her father, Toshio, was going to knock on her door to start their day. Hana insisted on clinging to the tiny hope that the unwise amount of sake they had celebrated his retirement with was going to keep him in bed a little longer. This hope, if it indeed could be called a hope given its size, was smaller than a mossy river pebble and just as slippery. In all the years that the pawnshop had been in Toshio's charge, there were only 2 occasions when it had not opened on time. On both those days, it had not opened at all. But Hana and her father didn't talk about those 2 days. Ever. If their pawnshop were like other ordinary pawnshops that traded in diamonds, silver, and gold, the Ishikawa family, who had run the pawnshop for generations, might have had the luxury of sick days and weekends. But Toshio had trained Hana to appraise far more valuable treasure. They found their best clients when summer ended, and the nights grew colder and longer. Melancholy was good for business. It didn't matter that their little shop, tucked along a quiet alley of Tokyo's Asakusa district, didn't have a name. Those who required its services always managed to find it. But if anyone was curious enough to ask Hana what she thought the pawnshop should be called, she had a ready answer. Ikiai. There was no other word that suited it more. Hana was little more than a year old when she learned to walk on the shop's dark wooden floors, and every step she had taken since then had been toward taking over the shop when her father retired. He was a widower, and she was his only heir. The pawnshop was her life's path, her singular purpose, her ikiai. But not once, in all the time that she had played as a toddler at her father's feet, or worked by his side as a young woman, had any of their clients bothered to inquire what the pawnshop's name was. They had far more urgent questions darting behind their eyes when Toshio welcomed them with a polite bow. The first was almost always about where they were, and the second about how they had gotten there. After all, no one expected to find a pawnshop behind a ramen restaurant's door. Anyone who stood in line outside the long-standing popular restaurant would tell you that its shoyu ramen was the best in the Taito prefecture. For some, the wafting scent of steaming bowls of chiti ramen noodles and perfectly braised slices of pork belly swimming in a dark and rich bone broth made waiting easier. For others, it made their time in the snaking queue feel twice as long. Still, they all drew deep breaths, taking their fill of the air's savory promise until it was their turn to enter the cramped dining room that might have been considered modern 2 decades ago. Yellowed walls plastered with autographed photos of the restaurant's celebrity clientele welcomed them as they weaved their way to empty seats. But despite stepping through its door, some of the hungry, did not make it into the restaurant's dining room. Instead, they were greeted by a pawn shop's dimly lit front office and the tinkling of a little copper door chime. The memory of that chime rang in Hana's head as she curled beneath her blanket. It commanded her to rise and accept the inevitable. She clamped her palms over her ears and fought a losing battle to keep her mind from getting out of bed ahead of her. Some of her thoughts were already almost dressed, fastening the last buttons of the pawn shop's crisp black suit uniform. Others were already at the office beneath her room, imagining how her father was going to spend the first day of his retirement, hovering close, double-checking everything she did. He would not say anything if he caught a mistake. He never did. The slightest twitch of his right eyebrow sufficed. Toshio preferred silence to words, reserving his energy and breath for his clients. Hana had become rather adept at interpreting his quiet breathing, half smiles and glances. Her only memory of him losing his temper was of the stormy afternoon when she was 10 and had misplaced a pawned antique watch. His eyes had grown darker than the clouds churning above their home's courtyard garden. And when he gripped her by her thin shoulders and lowered his mouth to her ear, her heart dropped to her toes. His voice was as quiet as the breeze, but his words howled inside Hana louder than any typhoon. Find it. Now. Hana did not know what would have happened if she had not found the watch later that day behind a stack of books in the back room. All she was certain of was that she never wanted to hear her father speak to her that way again. Hana drew a ragged breath, reeling her thoughts back to the present. An invisible weight pushed down on her chest. She had expected her future to feel heavier, or at least heavier than a well-fed cat. But instead, the pile of days teetering on top of her chest felt as light as a mountain made of mere husks, each hollowed out and spent before it began. She knew every second of the days that lay ahead of her by heart. After all, she'd spent her life watching her father live them. And now her father's life was hers. And from here on, nothing was ever going to be new. She rolled to her side. The edge of a yellowed photograph peeked from under her pillow. Hana pulled the faded photo out and squinted at it beneath her blanket. The eyes of a young woman who could have been her twin gazed back at her. "Good morning, Okasan." Hana greeted the mother she never knew and tucked the only picture she had of her back into its hiding place. She pulled her blanket off and peeped through her dark lashes. A sliver of sunlight pierced her irises. She squeezed her eyes shut and pushed herself out of bed. She didn't need to see to navigate her bedroom. This room and the pawn shop beneath it made up her entire world. And today, that world felt even smaller. And quiet. Hana cocked her head, straining to hear the familiar clinking of cups and bowls from the kitchen downstairs. But only silence seeped through her door. She bit her bottom lip. Retirement, she was certain, would not be enough to keep a man like Toshio from his rituals. Though the small shrine her father kept in their home honored the spirits, the god her father really worshipped was routine. The steaming cup of roasted green tea he had every morning was sacred, no matter how much sake or whiskey swam inside him from the night before. Hana pressed her ear to her door. There were only 2 possible reasons the pawn shop was this quiet, and neither of them was good. Chapter 2. Ishikawa Toshio's last client. The day before. Autumn had come early, and since its arrival, the number of the pawn shop's customers had doubled. Toshio shifted his weight, relieving the bunion on his left foot. His stomach growled twice through his black suit. He ignored it and adjusted his tie. This was not the first day he had been too busy to have lunch, but it was going to be his last. When they closed shop in less than an hour, he was going to be officially retired and would never have to work through lunch again. He had expected the thought to make him smile, but the corners of his mouth refused to be persuaded to curl the slightest angle upward.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?